So even though this tutorial is about simple shapes, I just wanted to show you how the same process is used when you're making more complicated things. You always start with a base solid shape layer to keep you from having to worry about going outside the lines. Now for complicated things, I'll put a sketch over top of that so I know where my values go. But all my value layers are clipping masks attached to that original shape. I usually work for a while on one layer until I'm happy with it and then move on to a new layer for more detail. The last layer is the lines layer, where you reinforce crisp edges and lines that you want to be very visible at the end. So we're going to take this exact same technique and apply it to some really basic, simple forms. When you first open up the tutorial file, you'll see that there are a number of folders with shape names on them. We're going to start with the sphere in the top left. So just like when we made the value scale in the previous tutorial, we don't want to have to worry about getting nice crisp edges when we're trying to shade things. We're going to deal with that step first by creating the shape of our sphere and then doing all of our shading on a clipping mask so we don't have to worry about going outside the lines. Now, making the shape of a sphere is really easy in this case. I just shrank my brush size to the size of the sphere. I sampled the middle value between the lights and the darks, and then just clicked once with the mouse on a new layer. When you're creating a base shape, you always want to be on 100% opacity and have a hard-edged brush. You can go ahead and make your own on the base shape layer, or you can just use the one I've already given you. So something this simple might not need a sketch layer, but I've included one just so that you can see how it works. I usually use a bright color, change the blend mode to screen, and then reduce the opacity a little bit so that you can see the lines, but they're not going to get in the way too much. The moment you don't need them anymore, you just click the eye to hide them. So then we're just going to do exactly what we did in the last tutorial. You're going to sample from the darkest areas of the sphere and start painting on that first clipping mask. You want to make sure your brush is around 25 to 30% opacity and that it has a pretty soft edge. And then it's just a matter of trying to blend and get a soft transition from the darks to the lights. I like to start with a shadow layer first, and then once that's looking the way I want it, switch to a new layer and add my highlights onto that one. I know shading forms isn't the most interesting thing in the world, but it is kind of the go-to exercise anytime artists are learning to use new tools. You don't have to do this, but you can go in and paint a contact shadow on a layer behind your sphere when you're done. It's worth noting that when you switch to the eraser tool has all the same settings as the brush tool, so you can reduce the opacity and soften the edge of your brush if you need to kind of do a nice soft erasing, say at the edge of the shadow. Alright, so pause the video here, go paint your own sphere, and then come back when you're ready to move on to the next shape. Alright, so let's move on to the cube. Because we wanted crisp edges around the outside of our sphere, we started off with a simple shape layer. Now the cube is almost all hard edges, but this time we've got hard edges on the inside, not just the outside. The easiest way to keep those edges sharp like that is to make each side of the cube a separate shape layer. Now we could just paint each side manually, but because they're straight edges, we can use the selection tool to speed up the process. So go up to your selection tools and click and hold until you see the option to get the polygonal lasso tool. This is a tool where you click once to create an anchor point, and then the selection tool will create a straight line between that point and wherever you click next. So if you click on the corners of one side of the cube, it makes it very easy to select. If you accidentally click somewhere you don't want to, just hit the delete key and it'll delete that point. And when you come close to closing the selection, you'll see a little circle appears next to your cursor. And you click there, it'll close the selection. Now make sure you do this step on a new layer. Then you can just sample a gray from inside that side of the cube, go to a nice big brush, 100% opacity, and fill in the entire shape. Go to your move tool and then move that over to the side. So there's one side of the cube done. Now we're going to do exactly the same thing for the other side. Make sure to keep this on a separate layer though, that's really important. When that's done, move it over so that it is up flush with the other side of the cube. Don't worry if there's a tiny little bit of a gap in the middle, we'll fix that later. Okay, so make sure you make a new layer for the top edge. This time I'm making my selection a little bigger on the bottom than the shape actually is. And that's because I'm going to put this layer underneath the layers for the other two sides. So we're not going to see that extra stuff I selected because it'll be underneath, but it just keeps there from being any kind of a gap between the top and the sides. Alright, and that's the hardest part of the cube done. We still want to go in and paint some values just so that there's a little bit of variation and it looks painted. And we'll do that exactly the same way we did in the sphere. Make a clipping mask above each side of the cube, and then paint your values on that. And because we're using clipping masks, all of our hard edges will be protected. Now you might find when you go in to paint the seam here between the two sides that there's a bit of a gap where white is showing through. That's okay, that is easy to fix. You're not locked in to your original shape layer. If you need to make adjustments, just make sure you select the correct layer, put your brush back to 100% opacity, and you can add a little bit to the edge of your shape. Or you can switch to the eraser tool, put that on 100% opacity, and erase little bits. So you're not locked into that original shape, you can always make adjustments. Another useful tip that's worth mentioning here is that if you click once with the brush or the eraser, hold down the Shift key and then click somewhere else, Photoshop will draw a straight line between those 2 points. So that can be really useful for cleaning up the edges of your cube or your shadow. Okay, so pause the video here, go create your own cube, and then come back when you're finished. Alright, so the cylinder is an interesting combination of soft and hard edges. It has the hard edges on the outside, like the sphere, and it has some soft blending on the inside, where it curves, but it's also got a hard edge at the top on the inside, the same way that the cube does. So we do need to separate the top from the side. Now, this doesn't have a lot of straight edges like the cube, so we're not going to be able to use that shortcut. Instead, we're going to do what I normally have to do when I'm doing my own illustrations, and that's start with a sketch. So I'm going to provide you the sketch already, but the way I created it was basically just tracing the shape of the cylinder on a separate layer and then moving it over. Then I'm going to create a new layer under that sketch layer. Make sure your brush is hard edged and 100% opacity. And then I'm going to paint inside that shape. Painting inside those sharp corners of the top can be kind of hard, so I'm not even going to try to stay inside the lines. I'm just going to go outside the lines and come back with the eraser tool afterwards to clean that up. This is also a great place to use that shift click trick. Click at the top of the cylinder, hold down shift and click at the bottom, and Photoshop will make a perfectly straight edge. So go ahead and fill in the entire side of the cylinder with a middle value of gray. Then we'll create a new layer to put the top of the cylinder on. And just like the cube, it doesn't really matter if we stay inside the lines on the bottom, because we're going to put this layer underneath. After that, turn your sketch layer off and then just go around and touch up the edges with either the brush or the eraser tool. At this point, you're ready to go ahead and do your values, and I'm going to let you do that on your own. I think you have the hang of it now. Don't forget to save this file when you're finished.